kind of beyond introduction. I'm not a historian, and I don't know dates, and I don't store facts very well, and I feel like that's okay because 90 years plus of facts and dates and all the remarkable accomplishments of Virginia Bell wouldn't fully tell her story. And so that's why we have her here today to speak her own story. She's going to be responding to 3 questions that I left at my table. They are 3 questions of faith and inspiration, who it is along her journey who has influenced her, an experience that she's had that stands out as a time when she has had to turn to God, and other questions of that nature. And so if you all are here from Best Friends, you're going to get to hear a broader story of this woman who was a minister's wife, and that has to be really one of the biggest feats you could ever accomplish. Mother of 5 children, another feat of nature. She did establish the Best Friends approach. She has shared that throughout the world. But as I said, none of that together is enough to really tell her story. So Virginia, we welcome you here to tell your story. Thank you.
I'm glad I'm still on my 2 feet. So I'm delighted to see all of you here today. I really feel your love and your support. I have to admit that 2 months ago, when Elizabeth asked me to do this, I prayed several times to have a complete life makeover. I thought that I prayed to have a complete life makeover because I thought that I needed something more interesting to talk with you about. But you'll just have to take me as I am. My life has been so full of role models that I had a real hard time deciding just which one to talk about. I went all the way back to my grandparents, my parents, my 6 siblings. There were 7 of us. There's 1 boy in the family. My husband, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And I thought about all of the friends that I have had through the years, especially the last 35 years, my friends that I have made through my work with dementia. And then the women of the world, when I have traveled, I've met so many wonderful women that have seen such genocide and such destruction and are so resilient. But I had to go back to my very earliest memories, back to my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1865, the end of the Civil War. She was one of 8 children, and she finished the 8th grade, which was the end of school at that time on the farm. And at 16, she married, and she and my grandfather went to housekeeping, and they called it housekeeping then, on a small farm in the community of Buena Vista, and that's about 8 miles out of Cynthiana in Harrison County. And in the community was a small country store, a school that at that time was built on my grandparents' farm, and then in the church. And I'll talk more about the church later, but they were staunch members of the church. And my grandmother, we called her Granny, she was the Bobby Thompson of the Buena Vista community. And those of you who are guests, Bobby Thompson is our parish nurse. My grandmother, without any formal nurse's training, nursed the sick and dying of the community. Many of the stories that I will tell, I got from my father. I adored my father he was a chip off of the old block of his mother. He was just like her. And he said that she would be gone days at a time, nursing whole families with diphtheria and typhoid. She had no nurse's training, but she knew how to treat the human spirit. And she was adored in the community. In fact, they said, if you can get Sally Marsh to come help out, she's the best. Then nobody in the community could have a baby without my grandmother. And so one day, many years ago, I was visiting down on the farm, and of course, I'll talk about this later, of course we went to church. And standing outside the church with my father, he was talking to a man much younger than he was, named Clifton. And in the conversation he said, "Clifton, you have given me a hard time ever since the day you were born." And I thought that was strange for him to say that, but my father was a big tease, and they both giggled. And later I asked him about that, and he said, well, when he was born, my mother was gone to help with his delivery, and we had to eat cold dinner at home. And cold dinner on the farm back then was really bad news. So my grandmother she helped deliver many, many babies in the community. Then the Comleys lived in our community, and when Lizzie Comley was a little girl, 10 or so, her mother died, and her father was not able to take care of her. So my grandmother invited her to come live with them. And she lived with them until she went through the 8th grade, which, as I said, was on the farm there. And then they sent her to Kentucky Orphan School in Midway. Some of you who know the history of our church know that that was something that the church supported. And when she had finished her 4 years at the orphanage school, my grandfather bought her a horse so she could have transportation to her first teaching assignment. But not only that, and often when I look at pictures of my father and his brother and sister, often she's listed just as part of the family in the family picture. But also, my grandmother took other girls that didn't have a place to go in the summer, and they would spend the summer with my grandparents, and she would sew for them and get them ready to put them on their train back to Midway. So that in itself, was amazing. Then I want to say that their home was open to everyone. My father remembers the peddlers that went through the countryside. There was no corner motel back then, and all the peddlers knew that they could spend the night with my grandparents. She would invite them in, give them a hot meal, and give them a bed. And a saying has gone down through our family, because she would often say to the peddlers, just go upstairs, the beds are fairly fresh. And so that has come down to our family, because many of you know I'm part of a big family, and they live in the west and the east and the north and the south, and they come to Kentucky back to their roots. And I have been known to say many times, go upstairs, the beds are fairly fresh. So if you come to see me, I guarantee you'll have a fresh bed. I'm just talking about family. My grandmother canned and preserved and pickled and smoked everything that was produced on the farm, and she shared it. But she was not all work and no play. She was fun. She played the accordion. She played the pump organ that I have in my home. And I've said that no one wants a pump organ anymore, and I've threatened the grandchildren. Any grandchild that misbehaves gets the pump organ. my grandmother never talked about her faith. She just lived it. And that has been a mantra for me. It doesn't make too much difference what you say, I think. It's how you live. But it was one of my first feelings of how it means to be in community and how to try to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. I just have just a little something that I had not planned to add here, but I'm going to. It's another example of being in community. When we unloaded our family home after 60 plus years, I can't tell you, my mother kept everything. And in the attic were all of the calendars that were wrapped very tight down in boxes, because those were the date books of the day. And on the calendar, she had written 22 hen eggs, 5 turkey eggs. She had gathered up the eggs. Baby girl born. And so that was sort of like it was. I was a part of the community because the animals, the chickens and the animals and the land and the farm and the people all had to work together to make a go of it. So I have sort of had a role model of community from way back. Some 50 years after my grandmother's death, I was visiting my father in a nursing home in Cynthiana. My father lived to be 95, and he spent his last year in a nursing home. And it was at mealtime, and he had his plate of food there ready, and he had 2 desserts. And so afterwards, I said to the CNA, what was that all about? Did he want the second dessert? And she said, I guess I'm sure you never have known, but when my grandfather was growing up, he was very poor. There was never enough food in the house to fill his lunchbox. They called it a lunch bucket back then. So on the way home from school, my grandfather left his lunch bucket at your grandmother's house, and on the way back to school, he picked it up full. And she said if he wants 3 desserts, he can have them. So I thought about that. After all those years, my grandmother was remembered. And to me, that's a role model of eternal life. But it's eternal life here and now. Now, the time in my life that's most difficult, I had no trouble figuring out, because it's the last 2 years when our oldest son died. It'll be 3 years in June of this year with pancreatic cancer at age 64. And then last April when Wayne died at almost 98. Only those of you who have experienced this can come to begin to imagine how difficult it is to say goodbye to a child. Now you notice I didn't say lose a child. You never lose a child. You have to say goodbye, but we have not lost our son. It's not supposed to work that way. The generations come and go, but to be interrupted at 64 is not natural. And I prayed to exchange places with him. David lived in Wyoming for his last 22 years. He married a Wyoming girl. He had just retired and had big plans of things to do. And the plans were, a lot of his plans were to help others in his community. He was fun and thoughtful and loving. And I'll have to say that he was not our easiest child to raise. He often said to me, Mother, it seems like bad boys have more fun than good boys. But I miss his calls, his notes, his hugs, his visits, with great conversations in the last few years when he had a son who was a chip off the old block. And we would talk about, why he would often say, "Why did you put up with me?" But he understood fully what I was going to go through. Wayne's death, however, was in the natural flow of life at almost 98. But I just wasn't ready to say goodbye when I found him, what I thought was asleep, but dead in bed. That was Easter Sunday night. He'd had a wonderful week. We'd gone to the Philharmonic. We'd been down to the convention center for the Sanders Brown dinner. He came to church on Sunday. He loved the church, the music. He'd had a big meal with the family that afternoon, ate a big piece of cheesecake, went to bed that night, and did not wake up. Wayne was a colorful person. He was interested in everybody, and he wanted to do everything. 2 weeks before he died, he said, "Honey, do you think that we could plan a trip through the Panama Canal?" He stood firm for justice. I could write a book about our times in the church in Nashville, Tennessee during the 60s. He was firm for justice. He loved the church and his family. Wayne was truly a man of faith. And in that sense, I feel like I know you all well. I'll tell you that Wayne was also a good dancer. In his early days, he loved to jitterbug. He knew that I was not a good dancer, but he said I was always good at intermission. After 77 years, and I say 77 years because we were married 73 years, and we dated the 4 years during college, I feel at times that half of me is missing. But there's an old saying that says that every cloud has a silver lining, and I have found many silver linings. I think there's a silver lining in the many ways that I have heard from people all over about what our son meant to them, and I could tell you so many stories and what my husband has meant to them. In fact, believe it or not, just yesterday in the mail, I got a card from Carol Rawls, and some of you all remember Carol, saying how Wayne had influenced her through her years at the seminary and through work here at the church. And to me, as I have said before, that's eternal life in the here and now. People remembering all the things. But I also believe firmly that both David and Wayne are enfolded into the mystery of God, and that's eternal life forever. I've also found silver linings in I cannot tell you the many friends we have, and mention family. We have a very close family, and my many friends who have supported me in these last 2 years with cards and flowers and notes and prayers and visits and on and on. My church people have been certainly a silver lining. And I have only time here to just tell you just one little thing that has really meant a lot to me. Many of you know that about 2 years ago, Steve Pruitt and his partner, Dwayne Fletcher, joined our church. And they brought with them family and friends. In fact, they filled the 2 pews that sat behind us. They were so good with helping Wayne with his walker, and so good to help him adjust his cushion. And since Wayne has been dead, they have just adopted me as their family. And so they take really good care of me, and they always bring me a little something to suck on during church, a little mint. And they've invited me to have dinner with them. And so many things like that have happened, so that there are there are certainly silver linings. I'm learning a lot from my grief experience. I've learned that it's not over when it's over. I think sometimes I have moved on too quickly when friends of mine have lost a loved one, or should I say, had to say goodbye to a loved one. It's not over until it's over. And I've learned that I'm not the only one going through this. In fact, I have friends that I thought I knew quite well who have said to me, I bet you never knew that some 30 years ago we lost a little girl. So I've learned that I'm not the only one. And I've learned that there's a silver lining, but you have to sometimes work hard not to be overcome with grief. Now, how am I doing? Okay, I've got a few more minutes. I am eternally grateful for my family whose middle name is the church. Now let me explain why I say that. Our family goes back to the very beginning of the Christian church, Disciples of Christ. In our community in Buena Vista back in the early 1800s, families were meeting in the homes to worship. And Barton Warren Stone was preaching at Cane Ridge at that time, and he preached one Sunday to these families meeting in the homes. And they liked him so much, they invited him back. In 1826, he held a revival in the Buena Vista community, and 40 people came together to worship. And in 1833, just 1 year after our church was formally dedicated, I have a list, I know members of our family who were on the roll in 1833. So we go way back. My great-grandparents were members of the Republican Christian Church. It has nothing to do with politics. My family, when I grew up, were absolutely, we went to church just like you ate 3 meals a day. There was never a question about whether you would or wouldn't go to church. We just went to church. And I've often thought that, looking back as a little girl, I don't think I remember that I was supposed to be learning anything much. I just thought I was going to see my friends, because we loved, particularly in the summer when school was out, I didn't see my friends until the next fall. And so I couldn't wait to get to church to see my friends and to play hide and go seek in the graveyard, as it said. But I think church should be fun. Maybe that's the reason we have the Follies. Church needs to be fun in addition to learning. And then when I came to Transylvania, I joined this church back in 1940. That's 78 years ago, and was a member of this church for 4 years then, when Dr. A.W. Fortune was the minister, his last 4 years. Now, I have to just add an interesting little thing here. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with my faith journey, or maybe it does. When the church, the frame, first they had a log cabin, and then they had a frame church that was built in 1870. Then in the early 20s, they decided to build a new church because it needed more space, and the church was going to be a brick church. So somebody needed to tear down the frame church. And my father agreed to tear it down and move it away. And our home was built out of the Republican Christian Church. We had arches in our garage door. We had the beams of the church are in the barn. So our house was built out of the church. And of the 6 girls in our family, 4 of us married ministers. So I don't know what that says, but it's kind of interesting, isn't it? And then I married Wayne Bell, and he was one of 4 boys. They all attended the College of the Bible. And my father often said that our family was lousy with ministers. And 3 of them served disciple churches all through their life. One defected because he said somebody had to make a living for the family. So let me check my notes because I don't want to ramble on here forever. And then since Wayne was the minister, those of you who are married to ministers, you know your family just, you just go to church. You don't think anything else about it. And usually I think our children behaved really well. But one Sunday, our son, David, that I talked with you about, was about 3. And we were sitting now near the front of the church. This church in Richmond, Virginia was a huge Gothic church. It was very formal. And Wayne had just started preaching. And David, quick as a wink before I could catch him, stood up, faced the congregation, started waving goodbye and said, "Goodbye, everybody, I'm going home." So it was interesting. Wayne smiled and paused. The congregation loved it. I think half of them were ready to go home too. And so they broke into uproar. Wayne paused and smiles, and we moved to the back row. The church has been very important part of our family. But to dispel any idea that we think that we're near perfect, let me just drop a bombshell. My great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, and my great-grandparents owned slaves. Now, and I had an uncle, a great-great-uncle, Abe, who owned a slave by the name of Fan. She took the Marsh name. She was named Fan Marsh. Of course, slavery is terrible. But before we mark my Uncle Abe off, I took a look at the word own, and I looked at the word disown, and thought how many of us through the years have disowned another, not just racially, but someone who's just not up to snuff with us. We've been judgmental, and we've hurt other people's feelings just because they're not our kind. I've thought about how many times our family has said one thing and done another. It's easy to say one thing and do another. When I was vice president of the CWF in the 70s in the United States and Canada. And I was often asked to give the sermon in other churches. And that scared me to death. I was so afraid I would have to live what I was saying. I would preach. The gospel is tough stuff. And I was saying one thing and found myself not always doing that. But I don't know about your family, but our family has been less than perfect. At times we have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. But we've always found that there's a wideness in God's mercy. There is a wideness of God's mercy. We found it in the church. When the church is at its best, each Sunday we've had the opportunity to be renewed over and over and over again. And many gifts have come to my family through the community of the church. And I'm just going to briefly tell you about 2 of them. My parents both died in the early 80s. And we decided to have a family reunion. And this year will be our 39th family reunion for the last week of June in one of the state parks. We are now 5 generations, the 7 of us. And believe it or not, 6 of the 7 of us, if we live through this year, are in our 90s. So we come together once a year, our 39th reunion. And by the way, I was the one, I don't like to brag, but I was the one who said, if we're going to come together as a family, we have to start out with what's right with everybody. You can always start out the other way. Well, it's really like a college degree in human relations. We are intergenerational, 5 generations. We're interracial. We never thought that years ago that would be. We're intercultural. We have different sexual orientations. We're different in religions, views. Some are very liberal, some are very conservative. In politics, we're different. Socioeconomic levels, education, we're all different. But we are a family. And I think that sense of community grew out of our years in the church. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is when I was family counselor, just after I got my master's in 1982 and became family counselor at Sanders Brown Center on Aging. And soon I was asked to develop a day center for persons with dementia so families could have some time away. There were absolutely no resources back 36 years ago. The kind of care at that time was top down. I'm in charge of you, you're the patient. I know what I'm doing, I'm taking care of you. It was not working. So I drew on my role models of community. And I dared to think that volunteers and staff, together with people with dementia, could have a life together. There would be no more us and them. It would be a place where everybody mattered. It would be a place where everyone was treated with value. Everyone had a unique life story. Everyone had a best friend. And much to the amazement of the medical community at that time, they said it would never work. 30, 40 years later, we're still going. We have helped change the history of dementia care. And I know that there's several of you in the room who are members of the church who are have been part of being a best friend in the day center. And also, we have the director of our day center, Taylor Penny, sitting back there, and Robin Dawson. So I'd like for all of you in the room who've had a part of best friends in the last 34 years to stand so we can give you a hand. Thank you so much. As I said, it has taken all of us. It's taken those who've been volunteers, but it's taken all of you when you meet someone who's not remembering well to treat them with respect. So I want to thank you so much for putting up with me. Thank you. someone, treating them exactly as you would want to be treated.
So you make an appointment and go in?
Well, we're open from 7:30 in the morning to 5:30 in the afternoon. And you can work 4 hours once a week in the morning or the afternoon. And you are a best friend to a person. You know the person's life story, you know their longings, you laugh and cry together, you do things together. And often people say, I can't believe that you can have dementia and fun in the same sentence. But I'll tell you, we have a lot of fun.
Virginia, is there a training program for people interested? What should they do if they want to explore that?
Okay. Yes, there is a training program. We have a 16-hour training, 4 hours a week for 4 weeks. Basic training about dementia, the different types of dementia, and on and on. And then every month there's a continuing education luncheon. Each day of the week has a lunch together. Each day thinks they're the best day. So there's training because when I was family counsel at Sanders Brand, of course that was a medical community, and they really did not think it was going to work. So volunteers have the same training as staff have to have. And so you are not just a volunteer, you are part staff.
I have a question. Have any of your volunteers ever come in need of having a best friend?
Yes, we've had several. And I don't think Donna, is it okay, Donna, if I tell your story? Donna Renfro's mother, Edith Hayes, was one of the very first 6 volunteers that started in 1984. Edith actually crossed over from being a volunteer to being a participant at the day center because everybody has strengths and everybody can help out doing things. And Edith was a volunteer as long as she could, and then she just gradually became a participant.
Other questions?
I'm looking at Nancy Morris. Nancy Morris's mother was the cutest thing in our program. She was darling.
Anyone else? Yes, Mary.
So I don't have a question. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. I don't have a question. I have a story. Well, okay. It's not that good a story. It's not her.
It has got me. It better be good.
It is what? It's very good on you. It's very good on you. So, innocently, I went to seminary and met a fellow student named Paul Jones. Jones is pretty generic. He ended up marrying the man, not knowing that his father, when we started dating, by the time we were married, I did know this, that his father was a disciple minister. What I didn't know was that his father and mother were, and what's the word we should use, Virginia? They were very, very good friends with Wayne and Virginia. So from the day I got married in 1776, and just feels that way sometimes. In 1976, I have known about Wayne and Virginia Bell, partially because 2 of the churches my father-in-law served were 7th Street in Richmond, Virginia, where David said he wanted to go home, and then Vine Street Christian Church. It's just those 2, right? And Wayne ended up following my father-in-law to those 2 churches. And there's a great story about Virginia has 5 children, and at 7th Street where this was happening, my husband is one of 5 children, but my mother-in-law had 2 sets of twins. So women, how many pregnancies? 3, right? So then when Wayne and Virginia came to 7th Street, one of the parishioners there said, well, you know, you're following the Joneses, but you don't have to live up to the Joneses with their 5 children. And she did, and then they got credit. I'm getting this a little bit wrong, but then she got a little bit more credit because she did it the hard way. And that church still remembers that story.
Goes along with the sermon this morning.
Yes, Janet's hot.
Well, I have a story too. May I tell it?
Yes, up
Okay.
here.
Can you hear me?
No, up here.
Okay, all right. I can't, it's kind of scary. Thank you, Virginia. You talked about people who have volunteered and then become participants. And you talked about how the church was your middle name. And it brought my mother to mind, who loved going to Best Friends. At first she wasn't sure, then she was happy to go, and then she didn't want to leave. It's not entirely true, but I think that one of the things I can share with all of you is that both my father and I, and of course my brother and sister, but Dad and I were here in Lexington, were helped by the program, especially my father, for the time it gave him to do housework, which was a new experience. He's learned that. But it helped us, Virginia, because there was a time in my mother's progression that she needed to be among people like herself. And it allowed her to find dignity that none of the rest of us could give to her. And a leadership. I remember you told me she would pray, you know, at the lunch, at a time when that was something she would only do there. And what it meant to all of us, and what it helped us in our own crossing over. You see, from being her immediate family to her church being her family, to her best friends being her family, was a blessing for all of us, and one for which we're very grateful. And I will say lastly that it meant so much to us that you prayed at her funeral. That was a great recognition of all that you gave to all of us. Thank you. Thank you.
We love your mother.
You're not done yet. When I was a student at Lexington Theological Seminary, and Wayne was president, I first heard his wife before I met her. Well, I knew who she was because I had...
Was that out loud?
Yeah, well, I was in the hallway. I'd actually graduated, but I think other than perhaps one student event at the house, I didn't know Virginia. I didn't even realize till I heard the conversation in the hallway that she was back in school. But what caught my attention was hearing this woman I did know to be a gracious host, a lady who moved with character and so on, talk about cooking hot dogs on a car grill. And I just, would you leave us with that image, please?
Oh, dear. Well, our family, you know, ministers don't make a lot of money. They didn't back when we were coming along. So we camped. We camped to the West Coast. We took our 5 children. But once Wayne and I decided to just go by ourselves. And I said, well, let's just, camp along the way. So we were out in the boonies, the place, and I'd always wanted to cook hot dogs on the manifold of the car. And so we got out our hot dogs and put them on the manifold. We were just getting ready to have some lunch, and a car pulled up, a Cadillac, and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "No, I'm preparing lunch on the manifold of the car." And I think they thought, they sped off in a hurry. They thought that I was, we lost my mind. But I still have a recipe how to cook a roast in the exhaust of the car. So if I live long enough, maybe I'll get to do that. Thank you.